You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Thursday, March 25th. I'm Kate Stockram.
And I'm Renee Roden. Undocumented essential workers are hunger striking. They're demanding help for those who haven't gotten any unemployment benefits.
Our members decided to put their bodies on the line so that Albany would see the desperation and the lengths that people are willing to take to win this fund.
The stimulus bill passed at the beginning of March without a federal minimum wage. We explore the history of that fight.
Prosperity is just around the corner, say the hopeful headlines.
There's been a biking boom in the city. Now cyclists are asking for more space.
And this path is being shared by, people walking, cyclists. I've actually even seen someone come over with a literal washing machine.
And recreational marijuana is on its way to legalization.
All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
From Columbia Radio News in New York City, I'm Megan Zarez. State lawmakers finalized a deal with Governor Cuomo to legalize the sale, production, and consumption of recreational marijuana. The proposed plan would generate an estimated $350 billion in tax revenue. The bill gives most of that spending authority to the legislature, not the governor. But until the law goes into effect next year, recreational smokers will still be prohibited from lighting up legally. The NYPD says it will be deploying more plainclothes cops in response to last week's shootings in Atlanta. Commissioner Dermot Chayes says the goal is to combat anti-Asian violence. Almost 1 in every 10 New Yorkers who died of COVID-19 last year was buried on Hart Island. The island has long served as the final resting place for some of the poorest New Yorkers. According to analysis released today by nonprofit newsroom The City, the Potter's Field saw a spike of activity in 2020, surpassing records set during the AIDS crisis. There's 3 months left in the race for New York City mayor, and half of New Yorkers are still undecided. The field of candidates narrowed a bit yesterday when Carlos Menchaca announced he'd be suspending his campaign. And some might have woken up this morning thinking their building had been swallowed by a giant cloud. But the fog has lifted, and it's 68 degrees here in Manhattan with some patchy sunshine. And some good news for all the struggling actors. Mayor Bill de Blasio says New York City's theater workers will get their own dedicated vaccination sites soon.
The show must go on, and the show will go on Broadway.
Eligible actors, stagehands, and ticket takers will be able to get their shots at pop-up sites at some theaters next month. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Megan Zarez.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Kate Stockram.
Allison Scola crouches down, with bright blue chalk staining her hands as she inscribes a name onto a sidewalk in the East Village.
So today I am chalking Rachel Grossman, who lived at 98 7th Street, and she was 17 years old on March 25th, 1911, when the Triangle Fire happened.
Since 2004, volunteers have gone to the places where victims of the fire lived and written their names in chalk on the sidewalk. Mostly in tenement buildings in Lower Manhattan, but also in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Scola has been doing it since 2011.
And so here's my attempt at remembering her and what she contributed for our sake. So we have safe work conditions and reasonable work weeks and that sort of thing. It all started here, really. We have to remember that.
It's become an important commemoration for descendants of the victims as well. Bill Swerse's great-grandfather perished in the fire only 3 months after arriving in the United States.
There's something really poetic about this impermanent memorial and then doing it every year.
Volunteers are chalking names as usual today, but the official commemoration ceremony put on by the Remember the Triangle Coalition will be virtual this year. Andy Sosin is a former educator working with the coalition. She co-authored a book called The New York Triangle Factory Fire. She says the fire alerted the public to the horrors of unregulated industry.
It was a seminal event because it awoke the country to the need for regulation of capitalism and government regulation of workers' safety and other progressive legislation came after the Triangle Fire. as a result of the outrage of the tragedy.
The fire was hardly the first horrific incident involving workers in the United States, but its dramatic nature, with young women jumping from windows to escape the smoking Greenwich Village factory, attracted widespread attention. Joshua Freeman is a labor historian. He says there are many low-wage workers today in the U.S. dealing with unsafe conditions. COVID-19 has only made that situation worse.
And many of them don't have a lot of recourse in terms of the safety conditions that they face. Certainly in the last year, we saw a tragic decimation of what we call essential workers who suffered. In many cases, working in close quarters. This was not fire; it was disease. But these problems have certainly not gone away.
For those organizing this year's Triangle Fire commemoration, the fight against unsafe labor conditions goes on. They say remembering the lives lost 110 years ago is more important than ever. Jack Stone Truitt, Columbia Radio News.
Allison Martin, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, is the passage of this bill good or bad for New Yorkers?
Well, I think that depends on which side of the argument you're on. I think broadly, it's a criminal justice win. The ACLU's done a lot of work around cannabis usage rates, and white cannabis users and people of color who use cannabis use at similar rates, but people of color, Black and brown folks, are generally about 4 times as likely to be charged with, a cannabis-related crime. So from the sort of 30,000-foot criminal justice standpoint, it would be very much a win.
Does it mean that folks who have a criminal record in this space would have that expunged?
We don't specifically know what it's going to look like in New York yet. In New Jersey, for example, there was a lot of back and forth during the process about what crimes specifically are we expunging, and they had this sort of specific aspect of their penal law that kind of hung things up for a while during the passage of the implementation bill. But yeah, I think New Yorkers can expect some kind of expungement. I think that's a priority for the lawmakers who are debating and discussing and negotiating this bill right now.
So some lawmakers have been concerned about what this means for sort of traffic laws and cannabis-impaired driving. Do we have a sense of what that final agreement on that area of the bill will look like?
No. In fact, according to my sources, as of Wednesday evening, while there were many media reports that the deal had been reached, the vehicle traffic law potential for cannabis impairment issue seems to still be the final sticking point. There's a balancing act and concern over avoiding over-policing of cannabis consumers while also maintaining, obviously, safe roads. It's really interesting because there's no kind of industry standard to test for cannabis driving impairment similar to, like a breathalyzer for alcohol. We all know what 0.08 means.
For New Jersey specifically, I know that there isn't a provision for growing cannabis at home. But in New York's policy, it sounds like that is going to be part of our bill. Why is that important? What does that difference mean?
Here are a few reasons that, advocates push for homegrown cannabis, for example. It's much, much cheaper. Cannabis in general isn't very expensive to grow, but, policymakers like to try to nail that balancing act of having taxes high enough that they're just above the illicit market so that, they're not inadvertently fueling that illicit market activity. I think a lot of lawmakers are concerned about home grow because, if somebody's growing 6 plants at home, who's going to come knocking on their door to say, oh, wait, you have 12 plants. Oh, wait, you have 18 plants. There's this kind of middle ground where people can kind of have a little basement grow or a little backyard grow, have side income. That's the kind of thing that lawmakers are generally concerned about.
Allison Martin is the co-founder of Cannabis Wire. Allison, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
The recent passage of the $1.9 trillion stimulus package was widely celebrated by Democrats, but one key Democratic policy was not included: a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. Workers across the country are pushing for change. But the fight for the minimum wage started long ago and close to home. As Layla Doss reports, New York City paved the way.
It was the start of the 20th century. Employers could pay their workers as much or as little as they wanted. So women, children, and people of color usually got paid a lot less than men. Finally, they'd had enough. so they were the first to demand a minimum wage. Men were already likely to be paid better. So at the time, most weren't interested in a minimum wage.
Women were even more underpaid then than they are now. That is, the wage gap between men and women was something less than 60%.
That's Professor Alice Kessler Harris, a gender labor historian at Columbia University. She says men also had unions to negotiate for them, and other workers, like women, were not allowed. But then World War I hit, and women stepped in to fill the gap.
In the United States today, the world of business is no longer a man's world. In New York City alone, 1 million women march to work each morning.
And they tried to join male-dominated unions.
Mostly men did not want women in unions because they feared that women would pull down the wage and that they wouldn't be reliable strikers and so on.
So they organized their own, like the International Ladies Garment Union. And by 1918, they'd passed a federal minimum wage, but only for women. But they were still paid much less than men, so women took to the streets, many of them.
Laundry workers, for example, in the 30s and 40s, led by a combination of communist and black women workers, they went on strike in the 1930s and were quite successful in New York.
Most union workers who were white and male saw the minimum wage as a way to control them. So at first, most unions opposed raising the minimum wage. They were afraid the government would step in and cap their wages. But then the Great Depression hit.
Prosperity is just around the corner, say the hopeful headlines. But around the corners wind the lengthening bread lines, and a whole new class of citizens appears in American society, the new poor.
Jobs were scarce and pay was low, so the unions came on board. Professor Josh Freeman, a labor historian at CUNY, says this was the beginning of a golden age for the labor movement in the U.S.
Today, people would be startled by the idea that there were hammers and sickles being carried down Fifth Avenue, the great rallying spot for all these marches and demonstrations.
This time, women and male supporters of the Communist Party lined the streets of New York.
We had Woolworth workers sitting down, occupying their stores until they were recognized. We had strikes in the department stores. So there was a lot of labor militancy and a lot of pro-worker sentiment.
In 1938, President Roosevelt passed the Fair Labor Standards Act and put a federal minimum wage on the books. Freeman says the labor movement reached its peak in the 60s, but that the protests of the 1930s paved the way. Since then, Congress has raised the minimum wage 22 times. Today's federal minimum wage is $7.20. In New York, it's $15, after hundreds of workers once again led a strike a decade ago. But activists say it's still not enough. They'll continue to strike. Daila Dos, Columbia Radio News.